Hey everyone, thanks for your time. This past week was not just busy, but another week of coincidence between the visible signs of progress for upcoming Artemis missions and another report by the NASA Inspector General Office about issues complying with cost and schedule estimates. In this video, I'll dig into the details of new status updates to Artemis II preparations and what that means for the schedule for the rest of the year. There's the OIG audit of Mobile Launcher-2, and we got a glimpse of the SLS hardware and facilities for Artemis III, 4, and beyond. So let's go ahead and go down those rabbit holes. I interviewed Cliff Lanham, the Senior Vehicle Operations Manager for Exploration Ground Systems, on Thursday, August 29th, about the status of Artemis II preparations at the Kennedy Space Center. Mr. Lanham provided valuable details and context about where things stand with Artemis II launch preps, which Exploration Ground Systems is in charge of. The Exploration Ground Systems program is responsible for integration, launch, and recovery of NASA's Orion and SLS vehicles, and this summer a tipping point was reached in terms of flight hardware deliveries to EGS. EGS has received or is about to receive all of the Artemis II SLS hardware, and there were a few updates on that. EGS is also finishing verification and validation of their ground-based launch support hardware and infrastructure at KSC Launch Complex 39, and Mr. Lanham spoke about that too. In addition to that infrastructure, EGS develops and operates the ground-based launch control hardware and software, which the launch team manages. There's plenty to go over from the interview, which I'll cover not just in this video, but upcoming ones. To start, Mr. Lanham provided updates on EGS verification and validation testing with the mobile launcher and systems at Launch Pad 39B. He talked about completing most of the work on the emergency egress system, recently validating emergency rescue procedures.
In the middle of a lot of testing, and we're actually on the downside of that curve, getting it finished up at the pad. So we just recently finished, as you mentioned, the emergency egress. Actually, part one of that, I will call it, where we're doing the actual end-to-end demo of, the rescue operation that would be involved. So we've just completed that. We will do an additional piece of that with the crew at a later date, depending on their availability and when we're at the pad. So that's to come. But all in all, that testing went very well. We have a few minor things that, like corners on the ML where they have to move the litters around if they were rescuing someone. So a few things like that. But all in all, testing went very well. So that's a good piece, and that's behind us.
He also provided a rundown of some of the different areas of V&V testing being conducted at Pad 39B.
We just recently completed a cryogenic flow of LH2 and LOX, liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, where we flowed from the storage sphere, which is the smaller sphere out at the pad for the LH2, to and from the mobile launcher. So that testing went well. So that testing is also behind us. When you look at the kind of jump back, and I apologize for jumping around here, emergency egress, we are in the middle of what we call our standalone verification validation testing, and with that, we're expecting to finish that up this week, and that'll tell us that we've met the requirements that the system has on it, and we can then call that successful and have that testing behind us. Yeah, and then we've also been working the crew access arm, verification, validation, testing. So we have had some concerns there with some software that we're working now, but we do expect to finish up that testing to the mid to late September to be completely having that testing behind us.
Mr. Lanham also noted that teams at the pad were running high-speed camera tests this past week and upcoming week. One of the items of interest I asked about was the setup and breakdown of parts of the emergency egress system, since it is designed for use when the mobile launcher is at the pad, and the ML would typically only be there for a couple of weeks around a launch. I remember asking you about this earlier in the year. As a part of the emergency egress, Getting it set up when you roll out to the pad, and then obviously having to do a breakdown. And of course, since we're in hurricane season, have you guys worked on those timelines? You might get into a situation, even hopefully not. But if you had to do an emergency or a quick action rollback, have you guys practiced those timelines already?
Yes, actually, perfect timing for the question. So when I talked about the standalone verification or validation and verification testing, we have been doing that over the last several nights. And, the first night was actually tearing down the system, if you will, to make sure we could meet that timeline and the requirement that we have. It's an 8-hour requirement. And then last night, they did the testing to validate that they could make an 8-hour requirement to set the system up when the mobile launcher shows up out there. So they just recently completed both of those tests.
He also talked about the status of the flight hardware that the SLS program has turned over to EGS for Artemis II launch preparations. Right now, EGS has the solid rocket boosters, with one exception, and the core stage. Next week, they will receive the Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, or LVSA. Those are the 3 elements of the Artemis II launch vehicle that need to be stacked first, beginning with the 10 fully fueled solid rocket booster motor segments. Then the core stage would be mated to them, followed by the LVSA on top of the core stage. In terms of the boosters, like the aft assemblies in the build-up stands, are those basically ready to go? Is there any additional work that needs to be done, or are they just basically waiting to roll into High Bay 4 and get lifted?
No, they're ready to go. We maintain a purge over there on them, and when the call comes, they are ready to be moved to the VAB for stacking.
NASA has a decision to make, eventually, about what configuration to use for a planned tanking test. For an SLS-only tanking test, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS, is the final element that needs to be stacked. ICPS-2 is currently being stored at United Launch Alliance's Delta Operations Center at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in the Launch Pad 37B area. So it basically just needs to be towed from Cape Canaveral across the causeway to Kennedy Space Center. We were watching the NASA Advisory Council meeting today, and they mentioned the ICPS handover was going to be projected in the October timeframe. Is that what you're looking at? And that, I assume it's going to transfer over to the MPPF at that point.
Yeah, so I would say it's that October, November timeframe is what we're targeting at this point. And you are correct. Once we get it over here, it'll go to the MPPF for servicing, and then from there we'll move it over to the VAB for stacking.
I would assume that you'll have to synchronize the hydrazine, loading the hydrazine bottles with the overall timing of the stacking schedule. I know there was a wet life clock on those, although it might be relatively long. But is that what you'll need to do?
Yeah, no, there's a limited operating life item there in terms of the wet life on the hydrazine. So I mean, obviously, everything we do is geared towards making sure we maximize those lives, the lifetime, if you will, in this situation. So there is a lolly. We will be well aware of it before we get into actually servicing.
The stack time for solid rocket boosters is the most publicized limited operational life item, or LOLI, but there are others for both SLS and Orion. The ICPS attitude control system uses hydrazine as a monopropellant, and those composite overwrapped bottles are loaded in the MPPF. That's the servicing referred to there. ICPS also completes the working pieces of SLS, the core stage sustainer that also houses the command infrastructure, such as the flight computers and other avionics, the SRBs that provide most of the lift to get the whole vehicle off the ground, the in-space ICPS second stage, and the LVSA that connects the ICPS to the core. Once those are stacked, EGS integrated operations will begin to interconnect the SLS elements to each other, to the mobile launcher, and to the firing rooms in the Launch Control Center. The most recent piece of the vehicle delivered was the SLS core stage for Artemis II. Core Stage 2 is lying horizontally on the floor of the VAB transfer aisle, and Mr. Lanham provided an update on that. So this core stage is in the transfer aisle now. I mean, I know that there was the Jacobs or the Comet team does sort of some components of the flight termination system install in the systems tunnel. I know you have a lot more time this time than the first one. Is there any, how's that going? How's that FTS install work going? And then is there any other sort of traveled work or anything else that you're going to be doing while you're waiting to stack?
Yeah, so you're correct in that the baseline work that Comet and EGS performs on the core stage when it arrives is that linear shaped charge, installations, along with the deck cord pieces that go in as well. So those are installed now. So the team has been working on that over the last couple of weeks. So that work is now behind us. We are now focused on the covers and getting the covers installed that cover up the systems tunnel. So that work is ongoing. There is some traveled work that Comet is working in conjunction with Boeing to, some TPS type items, and some cleanup work, if you will, on, some systems tunnel areas. We have picked up some non-conformances on the systems tunnel covers that we're repairing. So all in all, the work is moving along, and we're continuing to make progress there.
Comet is the EGS launch processing contract, and Jacobs is the prime contractor. The det cord he referred to is the flexible confined detonating cord, or FCDC lines, that are installed in the systems tunnel. In terms of the systems tunnel TPS work, there is some detailing work, I'll call it, that remains around the systems tunnel. One other piece of SRB hardware that will top out both the left and right boosters is the forward assembly. Those assemblies are currently in the booster fabrication facility at KSC. So all of the loaded segments are in either the rotation building or in, I think it's Surge 2. What's the status of the forward assemblies for the boosters? Have those been brought over to the VAB yet, or is that just going to wait until you get more of a clear idea about when stacking starts?
Yeah, so they are still over at the Northrop facility, and they're basically in I'll say parked over there in storage, waiting for the call for us to want them. We have right now on the books. It's in the fall time for the later part of the fall when we are currently planning to get them. And again, we talk constantly with our teammates on all of this and can adjust that delivery as needed.
There's more to go over from the interview, but focusing on the near-term outlook, here's the list of watch items at the beginning of the week before this interview and the NASA Advisory Council meeting. The uncertainty about the timeframes increased since the end of July, and the mobile launcher remains out at Pad 39B as August ends and September begins. After the information from Thursday, some of which I still have to go over, here's what that looks like today. I asked about the stacking checkpoint meeting, and Mr. Lanham provided some useful context about the timing of the meeting in relationship to when the mobile launcher rolls back to the VAB and when stacking could start. My understanding was there's before Moon to Mars and all of the leadership kind of gives the go-ahead to stack, there's going to be a checkpoint meeting. I also wanted to ask about is there an updated time frame for when the mobile launcher is going to roll back to the VAB? That would obviously be a prerequisite to stacking. Do you have like a schedule for that and any idea when that checkpoint meeting might happen now?
So typically it's all I'll talk the checkpoint meeting first. So we do have a checkpoint. It's a meeting that we get together anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks ahead of stacking, where it's multi-program attended, chaired by EGS. And at that point is where we would make that decision based on, any other factors that may be out there to go ahead and get into the stacking of the boosters. As far as the roll date, we're continuing to work on what that specific date will look like. We are still targeting the end of the summer, basically, which is coming up on us, right? So we're working through that. I mentioned all the testing that has been going on that we have to get done at the pad, and we're checking those things off as well. So we are certainly targeting, by the end of the summer to have that ready to go.
Would you expect that the checkpoint meeting would occur after the mobile launcher is back in the VAB?
Yes, we do have. So when the mobile launcher does get back to the VAB, we do have some work to do in preparation for the stacking. And so the teams have been focused on getting, our paper ready, getting, the teams ready so that when the mobile launcher does make it into the VAB, we will be ready to go. Again, we have roughly, 3 to 4 weeks of work there to be ready for stacking. And so we'll be focused on that. And in that interim period, as we wrap up that ML preparation work, is when we would look to have that review to say, okay, we're going to get ready to go stack. Is everybody good?
So summarizing these parts of the interview, Mr. Lanham said that verification and validation testing of the mobile launcher out at Pad 39B is almost complete, but is expected to continue until the end of summer, end of September timeframe. The boosters are ready to stack, and the standard stacking preps for the core stage are complete. And there's a little bit more to go on for the near-term outlook. He said that there is about 3 to 4 weeks of stacking preps after the ML returns to the VAB, and the stacking checkpoint meeting could be held as that nears completion. The autumnal equinox, when summer officially ends and fall begins here in the Northern Hemisphere, is on September 22nd. If the ML were to make it back to the VAB around that time, then perhaps EGS could chair that stacking checkpoint meeting in the mid-October timeframe, or at least by the end of October. And then maybe, assuming a go is given to proceed, booster stacking could begin by the end of that month. But there's still a good deal of uncertainty the farther into the future we try to project things. A few hours before that update from Exploration Ground Systems, leadership for NASA's Exploration Directorate reported in public to the Human Exploration Operations Committee of the NASA Advisory Council. They provided a high-level summary of Artemis status across the different programs for the upcoming missions. I'll go over that status summary in more detail in an upcoming video, probably at the end of the quarter again in about a month, but for this video, here are some takeaways from the public session of the NASA Advisory Council meeting on August 29th. Orion is the critical path for Artemis II, and there were a couple of key takeaways. The first was basically no change in the status of the heat shield investigation. It was reported that the independent review team had wrapped up their analysis, but that had already been suggested in late July by the report of outbriefs to the Orion program and NASA leadership. There's a decision-making process that comes into play at some point, but it's not clear where in that process Orion or NASA exploration are. They were said to be expecting a disposition, but no time frame was provided for making or announcing decisions on the Artemis II heat shield and or the Artemis III heat shield. The second was the repair and reinstall timeline for the Orion batteries, which has implications for the timing of Orion handover to EGS for launch processing. The batteries are out of the spacecraft for repairs back at the vendor and are not expected back for a couple of months. That would mean sometime in October, possibly nearer to Halloween, is the earliest those could be reinstalled. Depending on how much quote-unquote penalty testing is required, that could push EGS handover pretty far into the fall. We'd already seen reporting that Artemis II vehicle stacking was likely to wait for a decision on the heat shield, but these schedule updates could mean that NASA has more time to deliberate on that. Speculatively, if there was any urgency in making a decision, in theory it would be for a long delay option of basically demating the Orion modules, demating the heat shield from the crew module, and staging a new heat shield with whatever changes need to be made to the AVCOAT blocks. That would delay Artemis II by upwards of a year because it would require the repeat of a lot of integration and testing. If NASA decides to use the Artemis II heat shield as is for this test flight, then going back to the batteries that are being repaired, they could have the better part of a couple of months to decide. As I was saying about the stacking checkpoint, maybe they have to decide a little sooner than that on whether or not to allow SLS stacking to begin. But with the mobile launcher likely to be out at the pad through most of September, that puts the earliest stacking could begin sometime in October anyway. If the stacking checkpoint was no sooner than about the mid-October timeframe, that could also possibly be when a decision on at least the Artemis II heat shield might be needed. That's still upwards of 6 weeks away from now, though. For what it's worth, the Artemis III heat shield was already completed, and it's much more likely that NASA will choose to repair or replace AVCOAT blocks on that. It has not yet been installed on the Artemis III crew module, but that's another one of those questions about the timeline for that build. How much of an impact, if any, needing a newly outfitted and tested heat shield will be to the Artemis III Orion production schedule? The NASA Office of Inspector General, or OIG, released Report IG 24016 on August 27th. The report is a second audit of the Mobile Launcher-2 project in 2 years. ML2 was initiated in 2019 with a contract to Bechtel. In somewhat of an oddity, the report discloses the agency's baseline commitment for ML2, which is one of those watch items for Artemis IV. The report found that the cost and schedule overruns for the project would continue, and OIG forecasts that the earliest the new mobile launcher could support a launch of SLS Block 1B is May of 2029. NASA disagrees with that estimate, but the OIG time estimate and the baseline commitment time estimate are closer to each other than the official delivery date for ML2 and the official launch date for Artemis IV, which is still September of 2028. In terms of takeaways from the report, the most obvious one that jumps out to me is the disclosure of the agency's baseline commitments for cost and schedule of Mobile Launcher 2. The OIG report notes that the agency established the baseline commitments in June, and those are only being released to the public now, almost 3 months later. The baseline commitment, which is typically at a joint confidence level of 70%, is for ML2 to cost $1.8 billion with delivery in September 2027. The OIG report states that the multi-element verification and validation process will take 12 to 14 months, and then cites NASA as saying that an additional 7 months of integrated operations would be necessary before all the Artemis IV elements would be ready to launch. OIG estimates that the ML would be delivered in August 2027, a month earlier than the baseline commitment, which would work out to a launch readiness in May 2029. Multi-element verification and validation would take place in the vehicle assembly building and out at Pad 39B, where all the hardware and software interfaces between Exploration Ground Systems, ground processing, and ground launch control infrastructure would be tested. That would include subsystems like the computers and avionics, liquid cryogenic propellant loading systems, ignition overpressure protection and sound suppression system, hydraulic systems for moving the swing arms, communications and data, emergency egress, and more. This is a very high-level list of the services that Mobile Launcher 2 was required to support in the request for qualifications that was released in 2018. It goes on for 4.5 pages, starting with fluids and gases, which also include Orion hypergolics, breathing air, purge gases like nitrogen and helium, and coolant loops. There's the mechanical systems like the swing arms and umbilicals, the electrical subsystems, command and control, and other infrastructure like elevators, fire detection, and more. All of those joint functions between the launch pad, VAB, Launch Control Center, and firing rooms will need to be validated. In contrast to the OIG estimate, The report cites Bechtel as estimating delivery of Mobile Launcher 2 in November 2026. In that case, the schedule provides 1 month of margin between August 2028 and the current target for Artemis IV of September 2028. However, the OIG report also says that joint confidence level estimates found there was a 0% likelihood of meeting that November 2026 date. NASA's response says they are confident in ML2 completion, quote, by 2027, unquote. OIG previously reported on Mobile Launcher 2 in June 2022. In this report, they state that requirements for the SLS Block 1B vehicle, and more specifically the exploration upper stage, have stabilized, with no changes that affect ML2 since the beginning of the year. However, ML2 will also have to support the solid rocket booster upgrade beginning with the 9th SLS launch, and the report notes Bechtel saying they anticipate more design changes following subsequent flights. This report will provide a reference point going forward. One of the initial big picture takeaways is that we're now seeing threats build for the September 2028 Artemis IV schedule. From Gateway to SLS to now Mobile Launcher 2, it's looking less likely that all the Artemis IV elements will be ready by the end of 2028. In news and notes for the week, we got a look inside VAB High Bay 2 for the first time since December 2022. That's when Boeing announced that it had leased that cell of the VAB for final assembly of SLS core stages beginning with the third unit. Imagery released this past week was the first time we'd gotten a clear, unobstructed look inside since the announcement. It was also only the second sentence of news on the status of preparing High Bay 2 to support core stage final assembly in almost 2 years since that original announcement. A time-lapse video was released first, showing a slightly out-of-date point in time where it ends. We can see another level that had been added by late July when Core Stage 2 entered the VAB transfer aisle. Subsequently, Boeing published a more recent view of the access and support platforms after a third level of the access platforms was added. The news piece published by Boeing says that project is expected to be completed by subcontractor Futuramic in the fall. There was also a visual update on the SLS triple shipment that is headed to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. As I've talked about in the last couple of videos, NASA's Pegasus barge was first taken up to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville to pick up the Artemis II SLS Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, or LVSA. The LVSA was loaded on Pegasus on August 21st, and then tugboats transported the barge to Michoud in New Orleans, where the engine section boat tail for Core Stage 3 and the engine section itself for Core Stage 4 were loaded on the barge. NASA Marshall Space Flight Center and Michoud Assembly Facility Public Affairs published a set of still images taken on August 27th when the boat tail was rolled out to the barge, and August 28th when the engine section was rolled out. The boat tail is a short extension and fairing bolted to the bottom of the engine section that includes the locations of exhaust ports and access panels for some of the main propulsion system equipment inside. It is also the base heat shield for the stage where the different thermal protection system TPS elements are attached, such as the engine-mounted heat shield blankets that protect the power heads of the 4 RS-25 engines. Work on the Core Stage 4 engine section continued into mid-July, as was seen in a tour provided to the media on the day that Core Stage 2 was rolled out of the factory. Transportation of the SLS hardware was delayed as a consequence of the Artemis II and Artemis III delays announced in January, and rather than suspend work on the completed engine section structure, Boeing set up an environmental enclosure inside which would allow jobs like orbital tube welding to be performed. Subsequently, that work was wrapped up so that the element could be packaged for shipment. Those two pieces will head to the Space Systems Processing Facility, where the Core Stage 3 engine section already resides. Integration work on that unit has progressed further, and arrival of the boat tail will open up additional orbital tube welding, wire harness connections, and other jobs. The Artemis II LVSA will be rolled into VAB High Bay 4 for storage until SLS stacking is underway. It will be lifted on top of the core stage after the core is mated to the boosters. Thanks as always for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. There's more to cover in the near future. There's the Artemis II, III, and IV Orion and SLS hardware that is essentially out for delivery to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. There's more about the NASA Advisory Council meeting, and there's more about the big picture. We're on the backside of 2024 now, and it's been almost 2 years since Artemis I. That mission was the culmination of a lot of work, but there are some big picture themes emerging in the 2 years since that first big Artemis test flight. And so I'll be back to cover a lot more about that in the near term.